Okay, one thing that's a little tricky when we're dealing with pretty much any aspect of Mao Zedong's China is that we could talk about every one of these elements forever. It's a hugely complicated topic with so much detail to it, so many different experiences that I don't really feel I'm doing justice to any of the topics on their own. But look, what we'll do is we'll zip through now quickly this topic of land reform, which connects obviously to the consolidation of power and the liberation period of China. It connects up to the Great Leap Forward. There's overlaps. I even think that the dates that I'm putting on each of these periods, which helps you with chronology, they're a little artificial. They blend, they overlap, they turn into other things. And you'll see what I'm getting at here when we get into that point for you. So look, some of the key characteristics of the land reform movement period, which I'm going to broadly call between 49 and 57, are as follows. When you're looking at the design of this slide, I'm trying to keep some sort of sense of similar imagery so you get a sense of the pattern of how information comes out. So firstly, what I want to say is that idea of continuation. Land reform, the land reform period, the land reform movement period, the land reform era isn't just about land reform. It's actually about consolidating power for the Chinese Communist Party, or the Communist Party of China, CPC, CCP. Just to make your life difficult, they blend those terms. You can't really divorce the concept of land reform in the countryside rural area with the peasantries from a wider agenda of purging and controlling China as this incredibly large populous nation. So during this period of land reform, I can straight away say, okay, let's not talk about land reform. Let's talk about it being a time where there's purges going on in the Chinese Communist Party's leadership. There's a purge of government departments with the GMD's rightist counter-revolutionary influence all still remaining in there as far as the CPC is concerned. It's a time where increasingly the Communist Party and the Communist Party-run government takes control of food production. It nationalises that. And you could obviously see that's a very, very important strategic move. If you control the food, you control so much of what happens in the cities as well as the countryside. They set prices that the farmers are being paid. They control the food supplies into the cities and towns. By grain, we're meaning, of course, largely rice. This is a big part of this time period, and it's very much about power as much as anything else. It's also a time where we're seeing in the cities and towns increasingly complete attempts to nationalise, that is, take government control of the private sector, anything that had private ownership, private businesses, private factories, certainly anything of any size is being nationalised in the cities and towns by the mid-1950s. Broadly speaking, it's happening in this time where the main trend seems to be rural, but we can't leave out those incredibly important things in that time period. So if I'm trying to define, as you can see in this last green dot here, if I'm trying to define for you what I mean by land reform, I'd have to say to you it's reorganising the land ownership in rural areas. How did this happen? It is a process that was spurred, if not led, but certainly spurred on and encouraged by the various cadres of the Communist Party who are embedded in village life. But essentially what they did was release the crowds of the villages, release the community, release a mob sense of justice, and I'll say it again later on, a sense of people's courts. These, in Australia we have a term for it, kangaroo courts being formed to weed out those people in the countryside who are not quite loyal. Broadly speaking, by land reform, we're talking about the redistribution of land from wealthy landlords to the peasants. So if there is a wealthy peasant, a person who owns land that others work in the countryside, the land is being taken off them and divided among peasants. This particularly is happening in an intense phase between 51 and 53, but it continues on until 57. Who are the targets here? Well, partly there's a sense of wanting to reward the peasants for their role in the revolution, but they need an enemy almost created at times. The targets were these landlords, and the Marxists talk about it almost like they're feudal landlords, as you might understand from your studies of medieval Europe. These idea of there's these wealthy people in the countryside who control all the peasants' land, but that wasn't really the case. Mao's parents, if we go back to previous lessons, Mao's parents would be the type of people being described as a landlord, a person with maybe one employee and maybe a slightly more fertile bit of land. Perhaps through hard work and saving and investment, they made a little bit more money. But there's no one out there saying that Mao didn't come from a peasant background. So let's not imagine landlords as these kind of Western European understandings of people who own large areas or large amounts of accommodation and so on that people paid rent on. They're basically just wealthier peasants. The process really involved through a sharing of the suffering of the people through these people's courts type processes. And the purpose of these seems to have been by making the peasants complicit and accomplices in the consolidation of power through this revolutionary violence. There was a need felt by the Chinese Communist Party, the Communist Party of China, CCP or CPC, same thing. There's a need to expose the class traitors, the class enemies, according to Marxist theory. Now, they clearly exist under Marxist theory, and the Communist Party is wanting to expose this group, even if they are a little bit fictional almost within the Chinese context. Hopefully you're staying with me on this. Certainly there was a sense that there were people who might have been GMD sympathisers, supporters of the nationalist movement, and certainly they would have existed in rural areas. There were these small-scale rural capitalists, people who believed in making a profit on their goods and so forth in the farms and in the small village communities. That is at odds with the Marxist theories, the Maoist theories that are being promoted. So they are the class enemies, the traitors within that are being targeted here by the Communist Party. How were they exposed in these people's courts? Well, they were brought between a court to struggle. These would be called struggle sessions. Sometimes they're referred to as speak bitterness sessions, where the community would speak about their suffering in this sort of almost contagious effect of everyone sharing and pouring forth their hate, their bitterness, the suffering that they had for generations at the hands of the wealthy, the privileged. I want you to imagine these, and I've got some photographs on an upcoming slide. I want you to imagine these as everyone in the community coming together, perhaps sometimes in large numbers, and essentially bullying the victims of these sessions, the wealthy. In some areas, this identification of the traitor within, the capitalists, the GMD sympathisers, the wealthy landlords, this process led to a classifying of individuals and family class loyalties, and the party starts to formalise that. In this process, there was obviously a sense that some people would leave their areas, move to different areas where people wouldn't know them, that younger family members, kids would be moved into other households of relatives. And so we actually start to see not only the control of food, as I've touched on in the green area over here, but I've also got this, the controlling of movement of people and the start of developing of identification papers and needing to get permission to move from one area to another. Now, in this time, we have a number of anti-revolutionary purges that are going on. There are these groups who are counter-revolutionary, anti-revolutionaries, supposedly operating in society. And so these are referred to as the anti-revolutionary cliques. Now we can see three main ones of them, and they pretty much overlap and do much the same thing, but they supposedly had different emphases. The first of these substantial campaigns was the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries that takes place just after the foundation of the People's Republic of China in 50-51. It's followed in 51-52 by the Three Antis campaign, which kind of morphs by 1953 into the Five Antis campaign. And these pick up on the trends of the land reform movement era and all of these other ideas I've got going on. The Three Antis at first were anti-corruption, so it's looking for people within the bureaucracy, within government, who are taking bribes, who are doing things to look after their own family and so on. So you can see that fits nicely with a purge of the GMD. You could accuse someone of being corrupt. Anti-waste. There was a sense that as land was being collectivised, taken off the landlords, well, they may as well just kill their chickens. If they lose their own personal property, why would they pass it on? If the community gets my chickens, I might as well have a good chicken feed before I pass it on. The waste might be that I'm not going to let people have my grain, my seed. I would destroy it rather than hand it over to the party or the wider community. Also an anti-bureaucracy, a sense that too many people are sitting around keeping records of what's going on without actually really contributing like a peasant would. There's too many pencil pushers, too much red tape. Let's just get on and do things. So there's a very fast movement here, not necessarily very good records kept. And you might find this in your ISI when you're finding there's not a lot of really good written sources from government at this time. You'll find some because it's a big country, but you may not find as many here because of that reason. Later on, we've got the Five Antis campaign, and you can see hopefully the same trend. Anti-bribery, again, trying to track down those enemies within. The anti-theft of state property. See, the state now owns all the food. It controls all the grain. So if you were to take a little bit of extra food, if you were to take food to feed your family at this time, that would be state property you're stealing here, government property. So there's a Five Anti campaign. One of the Five Antis is anti-state, anti-theft of state property. Tax evasion, really a targeting of people who are perhaps not paying enough in tax, trying to confiscate wealth. Obviously, tax evasion in Australia is something that is a crime for good reason. But there's a manipulation going on of these kind of words in China. Anti-cheating of government contracts. The idea that you'd signed up that you would hand over everything, you don't hand over everything. You would sign up in your community that your community would provide a certain amount of grain for the local towns and local cities. And if you had a shortfall because of perhaps bad harvest conditions, you might be accused of cheating on a government contract. All of this is within this land reform movement era. And anti-stealing of state economic information is an interesting one. There might be a temptation to misreport how much that you had produced so you could retain some grain yourself. You might say, in our area, we produce a ton of grain, where in fact you might have produced 1.5 tonnes, and you keep the extra 500 kilos of grain for you and your community. Well, in a sense, that's not only stealing the property, but it's stealing the information from the state if you're falsifying information. Let's throw into here. Now, at this same time, there are a couple of very well-known and very successful campaigns to promote public health through vaccinations and literacy. The literacy campaign is well and truly tainted by the fact that if you've got people learning to read and write and improving their numeracy, you're also going to be aiding the state in its goals. And while kids are in schools, they're separated from their families, they're getting an education from government-approved employees, and you're also getting people to have a political literacy, and you're putting kids into classes where they can be exposed to propaganda. A couple of other ideas here. Stalin in Russia dies 1953. By 1957, there's a movement in Russia to de-Stalinize, to break down Stalin's cult of personality. And this greatly troubles Mao, who's very much modelling a beginning of a cult of personality upon Stalin. This de-Stalinization in Russia and Eastern Europe is copied somewhat in China, where they have a 100 Flowers campaign, where the government, the Communist Party, Mao himself encourage a speaking out against the waste, the bureaucracy, the poor management of the land reform process. After a period of time where no one trusted the government, there's an outpouring, more than anyone in the Communist Party anticipated, an outpouring of criticism of the CPC. Within a reasonably short time, I've seen written as short as 3 weeks, within about a very short period of time, there's a brutal crackdown and persecution of intellectuals, students, officials, artists who had spoken up during the 100 Flowers campaign. And this is called the anti-rightist movement. You might be getting used to that term now. One of the concerns that prompt that anti-rightist movement is Mao is looking at Eastern Europe, where the Stalinisation had actually led to an anti-communist uprising in the communist state of Hungary in November 1956. So we're going to look at some photographs here. These are images of the land reform movement in the countryside. In this image here that you can see, you have land reform laws actually being read to the community by a communist cadre, vote being taken by the community to adopt those laws and so on. The next two top images here are pretty clear, reasonably close images of what the struggle sessions, the sweet bitterness sessions might look like. You can see the community gathered here, the communist cadres and Red Army in this case standing guard, rifle under arm, as a landlord is confessing their crime. And if they're not confessing, they'll be encouraged, let's say, to confess. And we're seeing the wearing of hats, the public humiliation of the landlords in this image. An artist's interpretation of the same process here. You can see the violence and the anger in these images, the outstretched arm of accusation. This one image came to me, and it was certainly labelled a struggle session of the early 1950s. It seems to be a lot more located in a built-up area. This doesn't seem to be a village, and the crowd is huge. But again, we're seeing this imagery of public humiliation as the crowds gather, and there's some sort of podium over here in the back where we've got those being accused of crimes confessing. During the 100 Flowers movement, Beijing University and a number of other universities put up very famous democracy walls, where they actually wrote their grievances out, displayed them publicly for all to see, and these became focal points of the universities, where people could see the criticisms they were making of the Communist Party and of government practices and so on. People felt relatively safe eventually to speak out in this way. Certainly they didn't trust the government at first, but when we actually see Mao coming along to look at these democracy walls and to see the concerns of the people, there's a sense that they were able to speak out. We even see smiling faces with Mao, everyone very proud of the fact they're speaking out to improve the system. But then we have the crackdown, and the bottom images here are of the anti-rightist campaign. The image of this gentleman here, Pak, he is a conductor of an orchestra in Beijing, and the crowd turned against him for being a right-wing supporter of orchestral music and not being fully supportive of revolutionary art forms.